Thank you, Tom. I've been on a bit of a journey, which I'm now halfway through with this paper, starting with a title and getting further and further away from that title as the work progressed. In the current draft, there are three parts of the paper. First, I want to really try and ask, what does this phrase zero value of time actually mean, and why has it been chosen as the title of this roundtable? And second, I want to report what three previous roundtables have had to say about these topics in 1969, in 1976, and in 2003. And third, I want to suggest some hypotheses relating to a particular study of travel choices made by young people that we've recently completed. Now, we use values of time for two main related but quite different purposes. The first is to explain and forecast choices by travellers, and the second is to assess the value for money of public investments. The calculated time savings from transport improvements are usually by far the most important influence on demand in the models that we use, and by far the greatest proportion of benefits in the appraisals, especially the social cost benefit appraisals that we use. And there is now a widespread view that the methods we use give too much emphasis on improvements to speed for both these purposes, choices and investment. This view happens because of a convergence of quite a number of quite different arguments. I've counted up about 8 of why the importance of speed has been overestimated in transport thinking. One of those sets of reasons we've already discussed this morning. That is the view that technical and social changes are reducing the apparent value of time savings by either making travel more convenient or more comfortable, or providing the opportunity to undertake useful economic activity while travelling, or pleasurable social activity while travelling. We've discussed those, but they're not the only reasons which have led to this shift of view. Within limits, there are certain travel activities where the benefits are greater the longer time is spent on them. And this particularly relates to the health benefits of active travel, notably walking and cycling. Walkers and cyclists may well choose to take a longer, slower route, specifically in order to spend more time and get other benefits while they're travelling. There's a separate argument that many of the most important potential benefits and costs of transport policies are not adequately measured by time savings at all, such as environmental benefits, including energy conservation and the reduction of harmful emissions, strategic issues of the nature of cities, and of the quality of life. There are other cases where travel time savings get used for more or longer distance travel, or get converted into wider effects on land use or non-travel activity, both of which in fact shift attention from the short-term reductions in travel time of specific travellers into different and wider considerations, and I'll say more about that shortly. A quite different point is that the interpretation of this phrase value of time should not be confused with a direct measure of the utility of time savings or their welfare effects. And this is because the value of time, cents per minute, is not a simple measure of benefit, but is a ratio of two quantities, the marginal utility of time and the marginal utility of money. Therefore, whenever we cite a value of time, we cannot make an unambiguous interpretation of it unless we consider what the influences are both on the utility of time savings and on the utility of money savings. And that's not simply an issue of equity, it's an issue of understanding. A further, also quite different issue is that some transport improvements are specifically addressed to higher standards of comfort. Now, a feature of the interaction between comfort and speed is that empirical work has quite sensibly found that lower comfort travel, other things being equal, has a higher revealed value of time. That is, people are prepared to spend more money to save an hour of uncomfortable travel than comfortable travel. Unless, of course, it's the poorer people who are travelling in uncomfortable conditions and cannot do that. But one of the effects of higher comfort is to lower the value of time savings. We can say that achieving a lower value of time is a mark of the success of making travel more comfortable. And I'll come back to that later as well. And the final issue which has led to this shift of view is the now widespread use of stated preference methods, about which one has to ask whether they are producing estimates of the value of time with very carefully constructed, very high quality statistical performance at the expense of very low quality behavioural reality. Now, all these criticisms are controversial. All of them have been rebutted by one discussion or another, and the rebuttals have been subject to counter rebuttals and so on. That's not the point. The point is about zeitgeist. It's now the case that there is a widespread view that simply too much attention has been put on big flagship projects to increase speed and not enough on all the other sorts of transport policies, interventions, management and improvements that one can make on a local level and which affect people's lives. I have to say I think that critique overall is correct, even though one might argue all the separate components of it. Now, these questions are not new. Interestingly, nearly all of them were discussed at the very first value of time roundtable, which was number 6, the first set of episodes of roundtables in the sequence. Next year will be the 50th anniversary of roundtable number 6. Half a century ago, and still many of these issues are not discussed at a deeper or higher level than they were then. The Roundtable report for Roundtable number 6, it was a single paper by Harrison and Quarmby of the British Ministry of Transport, and I would count it as one of the most important of all the roundtables. One of the most influential and the basis for all subsequent British practice on value of time and many other countries as well. It's almost never cited, and I would like to restore its importance in the history of our subject. I just want to, in this presentation, quote 2 of its propositions, 2 of its arguments, though there are more in the paper. The first one is their very clear proposition that values of time only usefully derive from choice if the choices are realistic. I'd like to quote it in their own words. When travellers make choices, they may well not be making a conscious trade-off between time and money. Indeed, there are usually many other factors that both consciously and unconsciously affect their choices. For the researcher, intent upon estimating a value of travel time, there is a danger in principle in trying too hard to find a value of time in situations where time and cost may not be important variables at all. All this points to the need to approach the analysis of a choice situation with the primary object of trying to explain the choice, rather than trying to derive a value of time. If a value of time emerges from the explanation of choice, then the effort is rewarded. If it does not, then nothing can be gained by twisting the explanatory relationship so as to yield a time value. That's actually beautifully expressed, quite apart from, I think, being very valid. This was written before stated preference methods became common and almost universal. The problem is that now we use such methods, they appear to have solved the problem of complicating factors by experimental design. There is great ingenuity in scrupulously removing or controlling all the complicating factors in order, as close as possible, to reveal the real trade-off between time and money. However, this does not solve the underlying problem. If the respondent's real experience is of choices whose critical influences are not the trade-off between time and money, they may well participate in the experiment, answer the questions. The framing of those questions makes it almost impossible not to reveal a value of time. And the answers may give values whose statistical diagnostics are extremely good. But there must be a serious question mark about their reliability for forecasting choices in the real world when those complicating aspects which have been controlled in the experiment reassert themselves. And it underlines the point, in my view, I think, that stated preference methods are too easy in appearing to investigate many new segments of people or time or journey purpose or whatever. They always produce answers, and we have less and less confidence that those answers are based on reality. And I'd say an example of this is the contrast between the best econometric evidence in recent years and the best social research results in recent years and the best stated preference evidence. Econometric work and social research both tell us that choice evolves over time, sometimes quite long periods of time, with dynamic processes that take several years because it takes time for life at the individual level to change, for people to adapt, to find themselves in new positions, life stages, and so on. Stated preference as a technique, cannot address delayed effects and dynamics over long periods of time, and therefore must depart from an important aspect of the real world. The second proposition I'd mention from that Roundtable 6 is that other important variables, not themselves measured in units of time, are nevertheless experienced over time, and this will affect the estimated values. And the clearest case of that is the one of comfort, where a value of time entry point into the issue tells us that it would be a good intervention to reduce the duration of uncomfortable travel in order to reduce the amount of time experienced unpleasantly. There is, however, an alternative way of tackling that question, and that's to make the travel more comfortable. If bus seats are badly designed, we might spend an awful lot of money trying to speed up the buses, but it would be better to redesign the buses so that they're not so uncomfortable. In that case, we would expect the revealed value of time to go down, and that's a good thing. The reduction in the value of time is a measure of the benefit of reducing comfort rather than reducing the duration of the journey. And indeed, it's quite proper that we should look for solutions not only about the speed of travel, but also about the comfort and all the other related questions where that applies to. I want to move to the Roundtable number 30 in 1976. By contrast, this was not the most important study in the history of value of time or the most important roundtable. In fact, I'd say it had almost no effect at all. And you'll forgive me, however, for quoting two of its arguments, because I wrote that report. And I'm still smarting a bit, and I still think they have some validity. One of the arguments that I put then was that what is sometimes interpreted as a value of time should more properly be regarded as a utility of money, and that we can, in fact, turn the whole concept of value of time upside down, literally upside down, by taking its reciprocal. What we then have is a parameter not to convert units of time into equivalent units of money, but to convert the money costs of travel into equivalent units of time. And the argument for doing so, for using what's sometimes called generalized time instead of generalized cost, is that by doing so, we actually are using a more fundamental currency, that time is not subject to the same sort of vagaries of exchange rates and inflation and so on. But in a sense, there's something more fundamental about the human condition. This is what we basically have to operate with. And pursuing that argument, what I do in the paper, so I'm sorry, this is the one case where I would have usefully produced a slide, is to devise a 2x2 matrix with 4 cells in it. 2 of them are about people who are time rich or time poor, and the other 2 being money rich or money poor. And we can populate this table. Let me just take 2 of its cells. Let's consider a low income, employed, single parent with very little spare time and very little spare money. The utility of time savings will be very high, and the utility of money savings will be very high. The revealed value of time in conventional methods will appear to show that that person has a low value of time. In fact, the value of time in conventional terms is completely indeterminate. It's a ratio of 2 high quantities. The second case is a retired person with a reasonable pension and not working, considerable leisure. There will be a low utility of money savings and a low utility of time savings. The ratio is completely indeterminate, but the normal techniques would say that that person has a high value of time. Now, these aren't 2 completely hypothetical cases, these 2 individuals, because we're actually talking about me and my daughter. And it reveals, when that situation works its way through, that here is a case we're treating two individuals and their two separate values of time as of any use at all in forecasting their behaviour is very, very suspect. Now, I also suggested in that round table that time spent on travel associated with housework should be valued as working time with a high rate rather than leisure time with a low rate. And that just derived from the nature of housework. The argument was that housework is a productive activity with an economic value, as proved by the fact that there is a market for similar functions in cleaning and cooking and childcare and so on, which provide imputed values that would be very easy to apply to the travel associated with housework. I have to say that the suggestion was treated in the summary of that round table entirely dismissively, with language like housework being feminine pursuits that would be utterly unacceptable now. And it's nice to have the opportunity for putting the record straight that this is not a helpful way of considering a genuine economic issue. The third roundtable report I'd like to mention is the one in 2003, and particularly the paper which was written by a certain Monsieur Crozet, I think it is, who, as it turns out, is with us today, and therefore I don't need to say a lot about his thing. He has a lot of interesting suggestions, but one with a long-lasting effect was, I think it's the first time when there was a discussion of a new issue attributed at that time to Zahavi of what the implications for the value of time is of an apparent empirical stability in the total amount of time spent travelling. The report of the discussion was very dismissive, saying that this concept was not only untrue, but was positively dangerous in that it would lead to an underestimate of the true value of transport investment. Since then, it's very interesting that it has become a very important proposition. The empirical observation that the total amount of time spent travelling, while not entirely constant, nevertheless does show a remarkable degree of stability, has been affirmed in many empirical studies since then. And the interpretation of the significance of that on benefits has also changed. Probably the most important contention is that if travel time is constant, it is because the initial benefits of time savings are used by more and or further travel. And a softer version of that hypothesis, which is that some of the time saved by faster travel is ploughed back into more travel, is surely now universally accepted, because that's what we mean by induced traffic. It's when time savings are ploughed back to a certain degree, small or large, in extra travel. That additional travel will have both benefits and disbenefits, and among its disbenefits are reducing the intended relief from congestion and increasing energy use and emissions. And one has to take account of that indirect effect of improvement in travel conditions, because not to do so simply distorts the cost-benefit analysis. Induced traffic is important. If it's true that there are also wider effects beyond the initial time savings, then we have two possibilities. In the case of perfect competition, they will work through the markets. We will be left with some other benefit of equivalent value, but enjoyed by quite different people who thought they were getting the initial benefit when the investment was approved. In the case of imperfect competition, The eventual effects will depend on the nature of the imperfections and can include some important cases where the wider economic effects of time savings actually make things worse rather than better. That's not the general case, but it is a real case. Both our chairman and one of our current rapporteurs, Richard Batley, are both actively engaged in the discussion about this at the moment, and I expect we'll hear more of it in the rest of the round table. Finally, I just want to relate very briefly to a study that we recently carried out of which showed the unexpected effect that young people for the last 25 years, each successive cohort of them, have used cars less, both in terms of numbers of trips and mileage travelled, than previous cohorts. Now, that's been running for about 25 years. The young people concerned are now in their 40s and 50s, and it still seems to be having an effect in the UK and maybe in some other countries. That does raise some interesting hypotheses for further research. I would say that although there's no long tradition of it, it's very important that the age has become a central segmentation variable treated dynamically as people get older, and that this should become a focus not only of value of time research but of all behavioural research. Something important is happening. Some of the changes observed are definitely connected to income, not in general usefully measured by average national GDP, because there have been specific employment changes in the employment market for young people, and a changing distribution of wealth and income between the young and the old, which is one of the most important social phenomena in many Western countries. That will be important, and it affects both the money side of the value of time and the time side of the value of time. Both of these things are going to be changing and maybe having long-term effects on behaviour. So I think there's also an important research hypothesis there. There will be correlated effects on urban living, rented accommodation and higher education, all of which emerge as important. And the impact of the use of telecommunications technologies is clearly becoming more important, and possibly with a generation effect there. My own view is that the claims of autonomous vehicles are vastly over-exaggerated, both in time scale and in content. But the reason for that view has nothing to do with value of time. There are other factors in the theory of traffic, the behavioural theory, and the theory of evolution about why it's not going to turn out that way. As an overall summary, what I'd say is that it's a good thing if the value of time reduces. It's proof that we're making travel better. It should be an objective of policy to find ways of reducing the value of time, and that we shouldn't be afraid of a reduced value of time for fear that it will reduce the case for transport investment. There are other things that we can usefully invest in than speed, and an obsession with value of time is going to distract our attention from these other and much more useful improvements. I think I'm 3/4 of a minute ahead of my time. I'll stop there.